Welcome to Voice for Infection Prevention, where we explore the latest developments, challenges, and insights in the field of infection prevention and control. With a passion for promoting patient safety and healthcare excellence, we're excited to bring you engaging discussions with experts, leaders, and innovators in the field. So whether you're a seasoned professional or just beginning your journey in infection prevention, welcome to the conversation. This is Voice for Infection Prevention.
Welcome back to Voice for Infection Prevention. Today we are diving into an inspiring conversation with Angel Mueller, a leader who has helped shape infection prevention at both the hospital and system-wide levels. Angel's journey into infection prevention started with a strong background in microbiology and public health, but it wasn't until an epidemiology course and internship experience that she discovered her true passion for the field. She began her career as the first non-nurse infection preventionist at her hospital, quickly expanding her role and taking on leadership responsibilities. In this interview, Angel shares how she advocated for leadership opportunities in infection prevention, built a multi-hospital infection prevention program, and transitioned into a system-wide leadership role overseeing 17 hospitals and more than 375 ambulatory clinics and home care services. She also offers valuable advice on mentorship, career growth, and the importance of stepping outside your comfort zone in infection prevention. If you're interested in career advancement, leadership development, and the future of infection prevention, you won't want to miss this conversation. Let's get started.
This episode is sponsored by Clutch Recruitment, the leading recruiting firm in the country, recruiting exclusively within infection prevention and control.
All right, so let's start. I want to hear how you really even found out about infection prevention. Looks like you've got a bachelor's in microbiology, so maybe there was an introduction there, maybe not. But yeah, if you could just start by sharing how in the world you even found out about this profession.
Yeah, that's a great question. I had no idea what infection prevention was until I was probably 26. So as you noted, I have a bachelor's degree in microbiology and chemistry, loved anything microorganism related. I worked in an infectious disease research lab for a number of years. Wasn't really sure what I wanted to do when I grew up still. So I went back to school to get my master's of public health, still not really knowing what I wanted to do, knowing I still loved infectious diseases, like the idea of public health, was just kind of exploring my options in all of the public health courses. When during our epidemiology of infectious disease class, someone from the infection prevention program at the University of Iowa, that's where I was getting my degree, came and spoke, provided a lecture. So that was really my first introduction into what infection prevention really was. I thought it sounded really interesting and something I'd like to know more about. So I met with that professor and decided to do my master's practicum with them. And as I learned more about it, it was like that light bulb moment where everything that I loved came together. And I thought, wow, this is the profession for me. I knew it immediately, and I knew that this is where I belonged. That's where I was going to move into after I finished my master's degree, and I haven't looked back since.
Okay, great. So the person that came in and spoke that you followed up with after, were they working as an infection preventionist, or was it just something they were aware of?
No, it was actually Dr. Laureen Herwalt, who's well known in the infection prevention world. She's a doctor, a professor. She worked in their hospital epidemiology program, doing research and helping support the infection prevention program. So it was great to get to know her and see everything that she'd worked on over the years, doing research in infection prevention, supporting the program at the University of Iowa. And then I got to know all the infection preventionists in the program as well. And they all served as great mentors as I was really getting started in the field and learning more about the profession. They really helped me to fall in love with it.
Gotcha. In the practicum you did, so explain kind of what that looked like. So you were You were taking classes. How often were you in the hospital?
So it started as a practicum and just doing one specific project that we outlined around looking at environmental contamination and environmental cleaning in different spaces in the hospital. So I worked on that practicum, I think it was really just a semester or maybe 2 semesters before I finished the practicum. But then I stayed with the program as a student intern for the remainder of my time while I got my master's degree.
Gotcha. And then was that a paid internship, or was that?
Once I finished the practicum, yes, it did end up being a paid internship, which was nice as a grad student. So
Yeah. Great. Okay. And then I'm assuming that internship then turned into a full-time position?
Actually, not quite. So
Okay.
I was a long-term master student, I guess you would say. I didn't do it in the normal 2 years. I took that 2 years and I squeezed it into 5, I like to say, but that's all right. I was going part-time and doing some other things as well at the same time. But so when I knew I was going to be done with my master's program, I was actively then starting to look for a position in infection prevention, not real sure what that would look like. At the time, there were not a lot of openings, and especially for somebody that didn't have a nursing background. So I wasn't real sure what to expect. I was so incredibly fortunate, though, that a position opened up at the nearest hospital to me. And it was a part-time position, which is actually what I was looking for at the time. That hospital had reached out to the University of Iowa because they knew they might have some ideas about candidates that could apply. So I found out about the opening through my student internship, and I applied and I got the position. So I started really just working as an IP 2 days a week in the beginning. And that was okay with me at the time.
Wow. No, that's great. How long were you part-time?
I was part-time for actually about 3.5 years, I would say.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I had young kids at the time, so work-life balance, that worked out well for me to be working part-time. It was just 2 to 3 days a week for that period of time, and it allowed me to get a good understanding about what infection prevention in the hospital setting looked like, what I kind of wanted to focus on. I got certified for the first time during that first 2 years. So that was a great step to accomplish during that beginning phase, I guess, of my career.
Yeah. Okay. So I've got several questions now on this first position. First, how big of a hospital was this?
It was actually a 3-hospital regional system within a larger health system. So there were 3 hospitals at the time. Eventually, that smaller regional system became 4 hospitals, but in the beginning, it was 3. So not small, but it wasn't, incredibly huge either. The campuses were all within about, 10 minutes, 15 minutes of each other. So, a regionally small, area to cover. And there were 2 other infection preventionists working as well as me as the part-time IP.
Gotcha. Now, the 2 other IPs, were they nurses?
Yes, they were. So I was the first non-nurse IP in our smaller regional system, but I think I was also the first non-nurse IP in the larger health system we were part of as well.
Gotcha. Now, you said there were 3 prevention, or 2.5, counting yourself. Who were you reporting to? What title?
Yeah, so in the beginning, when I first started, we were reporting up through nursing and education, actually. It wasn't long after I started that it transitioned to quality.
Gotcha. But there was no higher level infection prevention person at this time? It was just 3 staff?
That is correct.
People?
When I started, really there was no manager, no lead, no director of infection prevention. It was just, I shouldn't say just, it was 3 infection preventionists working in the department, reporting up to a manager of nursing education, actually.
Gotcha. Okay. So then I want to ask a few questions along the lines of your educational background. First, did you feel, I guess, were people surprised by your background, or did you feel like you really had to prove yourself, or like what dynamics were there for you being the first non-nurse?
I never felt like anybody questioned my background or why I was in the role or that I shouldn't be. I always felt very welcome. And I also think that's because I approached everything, with a learning attitude. I was never going to come in and tell anyone in nursing or a provider how to do their job, even as it related to infection prevention. My focus was on collaborating with the frontline clinicians to incorporate infection prevention practices into their role. But I learned so much from them, and that's how I approached everything. So I think that's why I never really felt like it was strange to be coming from a non-nursing background.
Gotcha. And then one follow-up, and I think you kind of answered this already, but I want to be clear. If you were coming in part-time and you were the only person in the department that was a non-nurse, did they have you doing more, I guess, was your role more surveillance or more microbiology than what a standard IP would be? Or did you do it all and you just did what you could in those 2 or 3 days a week?
It started off probably doing surveillance more so in the very beginning, but I think that was just kind of a orientation, kind of workflow. Really, I started to dive into everything as time went on and learn all of the different aspects involved in infection prevention in the program.
Gotcha. And then, so obviously coming in with this background, and it's your first job in a hospital outside of an internship. So I want to know, one, when did you realize, or did you realize that you had a lack of clinical knowledge or clinical experience? So I guess, when did that hit you? And then how did you, and you hit on this a little bit, but how did you go about learning the clinical piece that you may not have gotten in your formal education?
Yeah, definitely during my internship, I remember sitting in a meeting and hearing all of the acronyms that clinicians used for different procedures or processes, and realizing that I had a lot to learn. I had no idea what they were talking about with some of the acronyms. And so I knew at that time I really needed to get out there, learn what was happening in direct patient care, understand the acronyms clinicians use. And that's what I did to educate myself, really, is just got out there and observed, listened to people, learned about how they cared for patients and what they did on a day-to-day basis, so that I could use that information then to enhance my understanding of infection prevention practices during direct patient care. And I asked questions. I wasn't shy to say, I'm not sure what you mean by that, or could you explain that, or could you show that to me?
Excellent. Excellent. So, and correct me if I misunderstood this, but you were kind of in a part-time role for about 3 years, right? Okay. So I'm seeing, I guess you went part-time for another year or so, and then it looks like you got promoted to a manager position. Is that all correct?
Yeah, that's close. Started part-time, moved to full-time. And then I actually had a lead position in there, which was a new position in the program, lead infection preventionist. I'm not sure that's on necessarily on my CV, because it was pretty short-lived, that lead title. Because as I got moved into that, it was pretty obvious that really wasn't working out with what we needed to do with the program. So as I was in that lead position, I worked with the individuals I reported to help transition that to a manager position, because that's really what was needed for our program to function at the levels it needed to.
Gotcha. So You have 3 people in the department now. When you went full time, was there still 3
I think at that time we
total?
might have been at 4. Definitely,
Okay,
in any department, any position or group, you kind of have changes here and there and shifts in people. So at times we oscillated between 3 and 4 individuals, full and or part time, depending on the individual and the time frame.
when you got promoted for manager, obviously you have 5 years or so of experience now. Were there more experienced people on the team, and then you were just interested and applied for this job, or at this point had people left and you were the most experienced there?
I was not the most experienced, but I think some of the individuals with more experience were looking more towards retirement in the near future. So perhaps didn't
Gotcha.
apply for the role.
Gotcha. Okay. So then I want to hear how, because there's a lot of people that are kind of stuck with a staff level title, even though they might be a sole preventionist or may have more management responsibilities than the title would indicate. How did you, I guess, initiate those conversations, or were you the one that had to initiate those conversations, or how did you actually convince the players at B that a manager is really what's necessary for this department to excel?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things I've done in my career is because, like I said, there was no hierarchy of positions when I started in the program. There was no lead, manager, director roles. That wasn't really an option, and I think a lot of people get discouraged by those not being already available that they know they can work their way up to. But I've never been one to sit back and just wait for an opportunity to present itself to me. I think we really need to go out, and when we recognize there's gaps, take it upon ourselves to create that opportunity, to make it happen, to use what we know about our programs and what we need to do to create that business case, if you will, for a manager position or a lead position or whatever it is that you see that gap is. And that's really what I did, to say, in this lead position, I'm not able to do what I need to do. I'm not able to sit at the table at management meetings and share infection prevention information, to hear from other leaders in the organization about what their needs are so that we can support their departments and that they can support our infection prevention program. So it was really creating that business case of the gaps I saw in the opportunities I saw for infection prevention to get more engaged with other departments throughout our organization. And that is what I use to help really guide that discussion around having a manager role in our department.
Gotcha. No, that's great. And I'm curious, like, were you able to kind of create this business case and then like one presentation, and then everybody was like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, let's do it? Or was this a kind of year-long process to where you were like working different levers to try to get it? Like, how much resistance was there towards the initial idea?
Well, it really wasn't that formal. It was, I mean, I wouldn't say easy, but a little more informal, and really just discussion with the individual I reported to at the time that, this is the barriers I'm facing as a lead without, having a manager title, and just working with that individual one-on-one to make it happen. So it was really less of a formal business case and kind of more of a discussion point over a few months time frame.
Gotcha. And then I want to lean into like the issues you ran into without the title. So I want to hear, and you've touched on a little bit, but I want to hear you kind of lay out the biggest frustrations that you ran into. But then also at the time when you didn't have the title, how did you still influence culture around you and still effectively, I mean, in some sense, manage, even though you didn't have the manager title? So I guess what stumbling blocks did you have? But then also, before you were given the title, how did you attempt to overcome those?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think I've always approached everything with, I'm going to do what I know is best for our patients, for the healthcare workers working in our organization, regardless of my title or reporting structure. That's always kind of been my true north. figuring out what we need to do and work towards that ultimate goal, regardless of, being a lead or a manager or just, even a staff infection preventionist in a department. But when that opportunity does arise, I think some of the barriers, I was having a hard time hiring infection preventionists into the department as being a lead and not a manager, just with HR structures. You can't be a hiring manager when you're not a manager. So that was one of the barriers I experienced when we had an opening, is just the struggles in hiring people. Like I said, the other struggles that you face sometimes are not being in those management meetings. Now that is kind of structural, based on the organization. It depends on how organizations hold those, what they look like, but at that time, being a lead and not being in the management meetings, you really didn't hear some of the information that you needed to hear, to take back and share with a team or to address. You had to hear it through other venues, which always delayed everything. So, communication was a big piece as well. But again, that didn't stop me if I knew there was a problem, even as a, staff infection preventionist, a lead infection preventionist, I was still going to reach out to a manager of a department, a director of a department, and say, hey, how can we collaborate to address this issue or work on this issue? So it's about having that collaborative approach, no matter what your title is.
Gotcha. So in these kind of initial roles, outside of infection prevention, who was your go-to person, or your best friend, or your best department that you really appreciated their support, or just someone that you really felt like you needed to be very close with and be on the same page? What department or what title was that?
I'm not sure if there was any one person or department. I think I tried to reach out and connect with a lot of different people, because again, infection prevention touches everything in an organization. So we really have to be friends with pretty much every department throughout the organization. I would say I worked very closely with patient safety, our patient safety officer at the time. We were in lockstep. I mean, obviously that was kind of the true north for both of us, keeping our patients in the healthcare environment safe and infection-free. I also worked very closely with our patient care units. I think that, I had someone I knew very well that worked in the ICU. So that's a great place to go and kind of see firsthand what the problems are. And during patient care, everything's a little bit maybe more elevated in an intensive care unit. You can kind of really see it in real time and quickly. So I think that was a great place to learn and connect with. And then I think the other place that I was really tied into very closely was facility services. You work together so closely in a healthcare environment, infection prevention and facility services. And I, leaned on them quite a bit too, to learn from just how the hospital structure is set up and what we can do to work together to create a safe environment. So those were probably kind of my three more go-to people and or departments that I connected with closely.
Awesome. And this may be the exact same question, and if it is, tell me, and we'll just cut it out. But who was your biggest advocate, to support infection prevention in general?
I think that's changed over the years. I would say we always have had and do continue to have great leadership, senior level leadership in our organization, in our hospitals, and throughout our health system that support infection prevention. I have always felt well supported by my senior teams, regardless of, being in the individual hospital setting or even now at the system level. And that has been key. And being able to connect with them on issues, help them to understand what infection preventionists are facing and what the opportunities are, and garner their support. We've been very lucky in our organization to always have them.
So you were a manager for about 5.5 years. I believe you said when you started you had 3 direct reports. So I'm curious as to, one, were you able to grow that team, or did that team stay the same size? And then also, what was the makeup of the team? And I'm talking more as far as their educational background or experience.
Yeah. So the team definitely changed a little bit through the years in which I was manager. We had individuals retire. We did have one individual who had come in to the infection preventionist role from a surgical background. They had been serving as a surgical infection preventionist. They had decided to go back to surgical services and work as an educator, which really was a great connection for us to continue to have with the department.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So we definitely had to hire some new people during my time as manager. And I think we did grow the department by maybe one person. Throughout that time, we were really looking to have a good mix of individuals. So individuals from different backgrounds. We wanted to have a surgical infection preventionist. That's something we had in place for a few years, and definitely looked to fill that role when that individual had went back to surgical services. So look for somebody from the OR or with an OR background that understood how the OR worked, how surgical services worked. And that was a great benefit to our department, because that's such a very, specific area where you got to have some very specific knowledge. It's hard as a general IP to just walk into an OR and work with that group and in that setting. So having someone with that background has always benefited our department, and we have always maintained that. So we have, that has been tremendous to have. Beyond that, looking for some different backgrounds, I have hired other individuals with Masters of Public Health. I think that is a great, well-rounded background for infection prevention. I've had individuals that I've hired from other areas too, not just nursing, individuals with backgrounds in radiology. That was, very interesting to have a person on the team with that background. It brings a different perspective. So I never really looked for any, one background in particular outside the surgical services, but to look to have a well-rounded team with people that have different strengths and can bring different perspectives and points of view to the team. And I feel like we were able to maintain that and have been able to maintain that, since then. So.
Now, from your experience and from the people that you've hired, and I'm sure this depends on the person, but I think you have kind of 3 most common infection prevention backgrounds. You've got a nurse, you've got an MPH, or you've got kind of a microbiology or medical technology or something along those lines. Have you been able to tell which background is able to understand the full gamut of infection prevention the fastest? I guess, who has this? A better way to ask that is, have you noticed who has the steepest learning curve when they get into a hospital, or is it just different?
I think it's different depending on the individual. You really have to take each individual, and that's why it's so important to start with that person, understand where they're at, what is their current state. I always love to start with the tools that FAPIC provides around self-assessments. So everyone, no matter what their background, should do a self-assessment and say, hey, where am I at in these infection prevention competencies? And then create an orientation plan that's really based on that individual's current state and where their strengths are. Not everyone on a team needs to know everything about surveillance for CLABSIs or, surgical site infection prevention. If you are lucky enough to have a team, everyone can know a little bit about everything, so you can support each other, but you really can build on each other's strengths and develop those to where their interest lies, where their expertise lies, and where their strength lies. So that's really what I've been able to do. I wouldn't say that I've noticed any one background being stronger than another. It's really every individual and assessing those strengths and working with them.
Excellent. No, that's great. That's a great answer. So, okay. next role. Looks like after 5.5 years, it looks like you made a transition to quality, which is interesting. So I want to hear about that experience. Obviously, this conversation is more focused on infection prevention, but what led you to go into quality? Obviously, at some point you jumped back into infection prevention. So I want to hear what made you curious, what kind of led to that decision, and then what did you learn about quality, and then ultimately led you back to infection prevention?
Yeah, great question. So obviously my infection prevention role for almost the whole time had been in quality. Like I said, we started out under nursing and then transitioned to quality really in the first year I was working in infection prevention. So I had been highly engaged and involved with the rest of the quality department for a number of years. And then working as manager in infection prevention, definitely learned a lot more about quality and in the quality role and how infection prevention really coincides with that role. I mean, there's quality improvement, performance improvement. You've got quality reporting programs, the patient safety aspect. Those were accreditation. Those were all of kind of the different components under quality in our organization, which infection prevention touches on or has to work with closely. So I had learned more and more about that and really saw how quality and infection prevention, were tied together pretty closely. So when the director of quality took another role and left the organization, that did leave that position open. I had clearly worked very closely with that individual, and the person that we had reported up through approached me about taking an interim role as director of quality, seeing how that went, seeing what I thought about it. And so I decided to give that a try, and it felt weird. I'm not going to lie. For a little bit, I was worried. Am I getting too far away from infection prevention, which I knew was my, kind of my first love, honestly. So I wasn't sure what I'd think about it, but wow, was it such a great learning opportunity for me to really learn so much more about, all the different aspects of quality. Like I said, you've got accreditation, patient safety, quality reporting programs, just quality improvement, so much there that we use in infection prevention. A lot of those are components are of our infection prevention competencies in the competency model even. So while I definitely didn't know everything there was to know about quality and the quality role and realm, it was a tremendous learning opportunity for me. And I really enjoyed being in that role and working in that role and working with an expanded group of people. I still had oversight over infection prevention, which I definitely did not want to lose or get farther away from. So I still considered myself an infection preventionist for that period of time, and still supported infection prevention both in our regional health system as well as our larger health system. Gotcha. But then we all know what happened in 2020. Once the COVID pandemic hit, everyone was back into infection prevention. No matter what your role was, everything was about infection prevention, to be honest. So even while I was currently serving as director of quality in our regional health system, when the COVID pandemic really started to pick up, our larger health system put a structure in place, so really an incident command system structure at the system level to address COVID, so that all of our hospitals across the health system were coordinating efforts and working together to address any issues for COVID, to prevent any transmission. So when that system-wide incident command, structure was put into place, they were looking for someone to really serve as that infection prevention SME at that level. And I stepped into that role to serve as that infection prevention SME. So Gotcha. That's kind of how I probably moved back from quality into more infection prevention role. Obviously, everything else kind of paused for a period of time. So really my director of quality role paused as soon as the COVID pandemic took off. And I was pretty much solely focused on infection prevention and COVID, addressing COVID at our system level. While that work continued and the pandemic continued, our system really looked at, this is probably a role that needs to be in place permanently, which was something I had been promoting for quite a few years already. I had to have some patience there, but the COVID pandemic really helped to open everyone's eyes that our system, its size really needed a system director of infection prevention. So that's when I transitioned back fully into infection prevention and to the system role.
Gotcha. Okay. So I've got a few questions along these lines. Signal infection prevention, and then I'll come back to quality for a second. And just to make sure I understood correctly, the system director of infection prevention, this was a new role that was created. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So then you saw that and it made sense to go there. How much of an increase in scope was that? Because you had mentioned you were over 3 hospitals that I think grew to 4 while you were the manager and probably a director of quality as well. When you got put over the entire system, I'm assuming that's not just that region, but also the other regions. So how many hospitals did that put you over?
Yeah, so we actually have 17 hospitals. We have well over 300, I think 375 ambulatory clinics, 13 home care areas of service. So it was quite an expansion of the role to be looking now at preventing infections and keeping our patients and healthcare workers safe in all of those settings.
Gotcha. Okay. I want to hear the transition into more of a corporate system level position. Obviously, I think once you get to that level, it becomes more about having consistent policies across the system and implementing culture change, and I don't know. It ends up being a different role.
Yes.
So I want to hear, how big of a transition was that for you, and was it what you were expecting?
Yeah, another great question. So like I said, this was a new role. There had never been anyone at our system level working in infection prevention. The need had been there for a while. Like I said, I had raised that opportunity for a number of years prior to that role being developed. And like I said, also COVID really helped to let everyone else see the potential for that role. We obviously greatly needed it during COVID, but it was needed beyond that as well. So once that was created and I moved into that role, it was definitely different. Each of the roles I've had have been very different, while all related, definitely different scope, different perspective, different goals when you're in those roles. Moving into a system role maybe wasn't quite as big of a jump as it could be at other times, because I had been serving in that capacity throughout the COVID pandemic already. So gotcha. I think doing that and transitioning to being that kind of system-wide infection prevention subject matter expert for COVID helped bridge the way and maybe make that transition a little easier in some ways. Though I think nothing involving COVID was easy. So everything was different during that time. That's for sure. So we were living in a different world no matter what. So I think that was part of it, where everything was different. It was okay. It made that transition different than what it would have been otherwise, I think. But yeah, you're right. So it's not so much now looking at just the specifics as to what's going on in a unit to prevent CLABSI, but what can we be doing across our entire health system that prevents CLABSI, for example, everywhere? Looking to see, where do we have pockets of best practice that we can spread to other hospitals or other care settings? Where do we have opportunities that we can see what's being done differently that can work everywhere? it's not just about aligning policies, but really aligning best practices that support that consistent high level of care throughout the entire health system. So it's a it's overwhelming when you sometimes just step back and think about that. But when you really dig in and start working with the infection prevention teams and all of the hospitals and care settings, it's fun. And I'm lucky to have such a great group of infection preventionists throughout our health system that are so dedicated to their roles, are so passionate about their roles, that they make my job enjoyable and easy at times because they're so willing to work together and support what we need to do.
How big of a challenge is it to have 17 different hospitals that probably have 17 different, very different, unique cultures and I don't know, just how people interact with one another? Like, was it a surprise to you when you kind of recognized that, or was that something you were anticipating and you kind of treat each one differently? And
Definitely anticipating. It was not a surprise. I had served as our chair of our infection prevention group, I guess you will, throughout the organization for a number of years. We'd always come together as infection preventionists and talked and shared things and worked on things together. It just really wasn't formal. So I'd had that understanding already. I kind of knew how, our different hospitals and our different regions operated. There definitely are differences. Every hospital has their differences. We saw that in our small regional health system as well. There's just different environments sometimes, different cultures. So it's definitely not a surprise, but it does impact how you approach the same issue or the same implementation for something slightly differently in some of the different hospitals or settings. And that's why you really, again, it all goes back to collaborating with the people that are there. I mean, I think that's the one big premise of performance improvement and quality improvement is defer to the expertise and the people working at the bedside or in the departments in each of our hospitals. They're the experts for how to implement those things. So, that's really, you got to go back to them and say, what works best to implement this best practice in your setting? The best practice is the best practice, but how can you operationalize it?
Gotcha. Now, speaking personally, and I guess you, like you mentioned, I mean, you were in a regional role before, so you had 3 different hospitals, but going to 17, I imagine your day-to-day job looked quite a bit different. Was this role the first time where you weren't in a hospital every day?
Yeah. So that's a big difference. And I wasn't sure what I was going to think about that. So I actually am fully remote in my system role now. I work from home every day. And I was worried about that. I loved getting up and going into the office and seeing everyone and working, with them, hand in hand every day. So I definitely was concerned how I would feel about a role where my setting was very different, and also how I work with people and communicate with people every day was going to be different. So it was a big change, but I love it, just as much. It looks different day to day, but it works very well. I think COVID has, with everyone going remote for a while, we really have a lot more opportunities now to connect, even when we're not face to face. Teams is kind of the normal method of communication now. So I never feel like I am separated from people. Can easily call, easily have a video conference or a video meeting. All of our meetings, everyone's in different areas anyways. So all of our meetings are virtual, regardless of where my office is. So it looks different, but I feel like we're still able to communicate just as much. Now, there's definitely times where it is great to jump in the car and head to one of our sites and be on site in person. That's needed as well. Sometimes there's certain things where you need to be there to really see how something is working or not working, and what maybe needs to be done to address it. So being able to do that is also important.
So you have 17 hospitals now. You were managing 4 people. How many people do you how many people are you managing, number one? And then secondly, is there a direct reporting structure, or are you kind of outside do you not have any direct reports and it's just your responsibility to influence the teams reporting up at their hospital? So I guess what's the system structure?
Yes, we do not have a direct reporting structure. So I actually don't have all of the IPs reporting directly to me. It's really more of a dotted line collaboration with the infection prevention departments in each of our hospitals and care settings. Perfect. I do have one infection preventionist that reports to me, and she's our system surveillance and NHSN expert, for lack of a better word. So we implemented a new surveillance system, put somebody in that role to help guide that work and to service that level of expertise. And that person does report to me.
Gotcha. Okay. And this is a fairly common thing now, this structure. So, but I always ask this to anybody at your level, making a transition from having direct reports to not having direct reports. Has it been a challenge for you to have the influence you want without a direct reporting structure? And if so, how have you made sure to position yourself to where you have the authority that you need?
I think there's challenges both ways, whether you have direct reports or not. I think it's really more about engaging everybody in the decision making. So I think that's the most important thing, whether they're direct reports or you're working with them from an influencing standpoint, which infection preventionists are used to in our role. Rarely do we have authority over much. So we're used to that influencing perspective to accomplishing the things we know need to be accomplished. And so I think that's really where I've always tried to operate and continue to operate. Bringing together the IP leaders in each of our hospitals and care settings to work through issues, to make decisions. I think that's the most important thing, whether they reported to me or not. We have a structure set up that I think supports that process very well. Subcommittees that are really our committees of expertise, whether it's directed at CLABSI prevention, CODI prevention, or addressing emerging pathogens, outbreaks, pandemics, having those kind of subgroups or committees to really dig into evidence and best practice and make decisions to bring back to the larger group of infection preventionists as a whole to, align and approve is really what works best, or what I have found works best. And then always approaching everything with not what is everybody currently doing and trying to find the common denominator for what we should be doing, but going back to what is the evidence support that is, what is the best practice out there? And if that's your true north, it's pretty easy to get everyone to align to that.
Gotcha. Okay. I've got 2 questions for you left. Number one, I want to go back to quality for a second. When I talk to people, especially at the director level, maybe manager level too, but most hospital systems report up through quality. So it seemed from a recruiting perspective that like the natural next step for somebody that's capped out infection is to get promoted into quality. But the more I've asked about that and talked about that, it's not nearly as natural or as seamless as you might think based on the hospital's reporting structure. So obviously it was a good learning opportunity for you and it was a good challenge. But is that a natural progression? And the reason I ask is because most health systems, system director is where you're capped out. You're starting to see some AVP type roles. But if you were, let's say you had been in the system role for 10 years and you're looking to take the next step, what is a natural next step for an infection prevention? I mean, is the only option to find a place with a few more hospitals, or is there a more kind of natural progression?
I think it all depends on what you're looking for in your, in your career path. I've spent a lot of time in the APIC Professional Development Committee, where I feel like I've learned so much about professional development and advancement in our career as an infection preventionist. And it's really about what you want or look for. Not everyone is looking for that title. That's a next step title. I mean, we can still grow as an infection preventionist and not have a different title. We can develop from that novice to proficient to expert infection preventionist. And some people that you might just want to grow to be an expert infection preventionist, or grow to be an expert in a certain area of infection prevention. Maybe that's surveillance. Maybe it's, another niche within infection prevention. So that's always an option as well. And, I think that I strive for that too. It's not about the title. It's about growing in my knowledge base and my competencies and my skills as an infection preventionist. Now, there could be those that want to grow as, into different roles as well. And we've seen such change in the 15 years that I've been an infection preventionist. I don't think when I started, I'm not sure if there were maybe a handful of system directors of infection prevention 15 years ago.
Right.
I don't think that was a common role. So that has been tremendous growth in advancement of this role. And I think we're going to see more of that as time goes on. And who knows what that looks like? Are we going to see chief infection prevention officers at some point? There may already be some out there. So
I've seen a couple.
Yeah. So I hate to say, what the limits are, because I think for infection prevention, the sky's the limit, regardless of if that's a title or just your growth in your knowledge base and competencies.
Awesome. And that leads, I'm glad you mentioned it, because that was my last question. I want to talk about your kind of extracurricular stuff. You've been involved with APIC for many years. You've held different positions. So I want to go into, I just want to hear one, why did you do it? What's your experience been like? And how, I guess, would you recommend other people do this? And how soon? How quickly should somebody get involved with APIC, particularly their local chapter?
Yeah. So as soon as you start working as an infection preventionist, you should definitely get involved in your local chapter. Become a member of APIC, become a member of your local chapter. That's where we find a lot of our mentors, our resources, those people that we can call up with any questions we may have as we're learning the role and learning what we need to know to be an effective infection preventionist. I have so greatly enjoyed working with APIC and working on the APIC Professional Development Committee and working with my local chapter as president and a board member. It has been such a highlight of my career to date. So many wonderful opportunities to work on different projects and to get to know some amazing people. I was lucky enough to work with the Professional Development Committee on the updated APIC Infection Preventionist Competency Model a number of years ago. That was a huge highlight, and I've learned so much through that work. I think that is something that all IPs need to think about. That's part of our growth too, is how can we be involved to learn more, but also to give back. Every IP I've met has been so willing to give back, whether it's to an individual that they're working with or mentoring, or to the profession as a whole. What can we do to give back? And I have learned that while giving back, I have, learned so much through those opportunities. And it's been such an honor and a blessing to be involved in the APIC chapter and professional development committee.
Awesome. Okay. All right. That is all I have, but I do want to give you a quick chance to say anything at all that either you'd like to say that I didn't ask, or anything that you just think would be particularly helpful to people either just getting started in their infection prevention career or deciding if they should get into it.
A couple things. One, it's a wonderful profession filled with wonderful people, and you will never be bored if you start down the path of infection prevention. You learn something new every day. In my 15 plus years, I can honestly say I have learned something new every single one of those days. The other thing that I think is really important that goes back to the last question as well is, don't wait until you're completely comfortable with something before, taking that next step. Get involved, push yourself a little bit beyond that comfort zone. I think that's something that I've done that sometimes is hard, but that is how you learn and grow. If you wait until you feel you're completely ready, you're probably never going to be completely ready and never take that next step. It's okay to go out a little bit on a limb and push yourself to do something you've never done. I remember the first time I submitted an abstract to speak at an APIC national conference. I kept thinking, why am I doing this? I hate speaking in front of people. I am not prepared. I'm not ready. I need more years of experience, more practice. But I pushed myself to do it anyways, out of my comfort zone, and it was one of the best experiences of my life. And I can say that about so many things that I have done working as an infection preventionist. It's such an amazing profession, amazing opportunity. Again, like I've said before, filled with amazing people that will support you every step of the way. Get involved, push yourself, and don't be afraid to jump in headfirst.
Awesome.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Voice for Infection Prevention. We hope you found our discussions informative and insightful. Remember to subscribe to our podcast for more conversations with experts in the field, and don't forget to leave us a review to let us know what you think. For additional resources and to stay updated on the latest news in infection prevention, visit our website at voiceforip.com. Thank you again for listening. Until next time, stay safe and continue your commitment to excellence in infection prevention.